Hello there, James. How are you?
Good. How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing very well. And I'm Glenn Loury. This is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. And I have the good fortune of speaking with James Forman, who's professor of law at Yale University and the author, most recently, of this book that I'm holding up right now, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. James, congratulations on the book, man. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you. It's exciting to have it out.
So, the title, in a way, kind of speaks for itself, and I thought that could be the subject of our conversation today. Let me just introduce it very briefly. Everybody within earshot of our conversation knows that there's a fierce debate going on in American politics and public policy circles now about race and crime and policing and punishment in America. The over-incarceration of African American men and women, the adverse effects on blacks of policies like stop and frisk or zero tolerance policing and the war on drugs, the deep concern that has given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement about the use of illicit use of sometimes deadly force by police officers in American cities. And this is all having a huge impact on the contemporary discussion. Now, here you come with this book about, and of course I'm going to let you tell us what your book is about, the ways in which some black constituencies have reacted at times with a punitiveness to the problem of maintaining order and dealing with public safety in their cities. And it's a very significant intervention in the national discourse, I think. So I'm really grateful that you're willing to talk to us about the book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're after in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can, I'll kind of start with a story from when I was practicing in Washington, D.C., which really kind of brought me to this topic, which
Absolutely.
is I was representing a young man by the name of Brandon. This kind of story happened time and time again, but this one in particular always stuck out in my mind. I'm not exactly sure why, but he was charged with possession of a gun, possession of a small amount of marijuana. So this is Washington, D.C., 1990s. I'm his public defender, and I've come to this work because I see it as the civil rights work of my generation, and I still do. And my parents met in SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and there I was, I got to go to Brown and got to clerk on the Supreme Court, and now I was a public defender. And at the same time, there were a lot of Brandons, right? We already knew, even though we didn't have the term mass incarceration, we already knew that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. The Sentencing Project had reported that. We don't have and didn't and don't have as good data on black women, but everything that I saw suggested that there were incredible disparities there. And so I take this job to fight that fight. I'm in court. I'm asking for Brandon to be sent home. I've got letters from teachers saying he's a good kid. I've got his mom and grandmom there in court. And I've got an African-American prosecutor who wants to send him to Oak Hill, the juvenile prison. And now Brandon's African-American, the prosecutor's African-American, and this place, Oak Hill, she wants to send him to is a dungeon, right? No functioning school, no job training programs, no mental health treatment, drugs and violence everywhere.
Yeah.
Person's got to make the decision is a judge, Judge Curtis Walker. I call him in the book. I changed the names of the judges and my clients to protect their privacy.
Sure.
This is now court, which is supposed to be confidential. And Judge Walker says, he says to Brandon, Mr. Forman has been telling me that you've had a tough life, son. You deserve a second chance. Let me tell you about tough. Judge Walker says, let me tell you about Jim Crow. Let me tell you about segregation. See, Judge Walker had grown up in those times.
Yeah.
And he told Brandon about them. And then it was all said and done. He said, son, people fought, marched, and died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you. And he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, actions have consequences, and your consequence is Oak Hill.
Wow.
He locked up. So when I left court that day, I thought about the fact that, Judge Walker wasn't alone. The city council that passed the laws that Brandon was sentenced under was a majority African-American city council. They passed the gun laws and the drug laws. The police chief in D.C. was black. The police force was majority black. All the guards at Oak Hill, where Brandon was going, were African-American. And so it occurred to me, to put it mildly, that not everybody in this community saw things exactly as my colleagues at the public defenders did.
Yeah.
The judge had invoked the same history that brought me to court as a justification for incarceration. So I felt like then, and as I said, this story repeated itself over and over again, but I felt like at that moment that this issue was more complicated. I never changed my views and haven't changed my views about the correctness of the judge's decision. However, I did know that there was a story that I felt needed to be written about how it was that an African-American community and many black elected officials, there was an 800% increase in the 1970s, black elected officials coming into power after the decline of formal Jim Crow, struggling with crime and violence, under a lot of pressure, how it was that they came to endorse many of the same policies that the nation was pursuing. And so that was the story that I wanted to tell in this book.
I see. That's very interesting and very powerful. So how did they come to endorse and promulgate these punitive policies?
So the first thing that we have to contend with is crime and violence and addiction. So we know about the crack years. 20 years before the crack years, there were the heroin years, right?
Yeah.
Heroin tore through black communities across America in the 1960s. The homicide rate in D.C. tripled in the 1960s. Heroin, everyone was being tested for drugs entering the D.C. jail in the early 1960s. They test people whenever they entered. In the 1960s, 3% of the folks coming in tested positive for heroin. In 1968, it was 45%. And it wasn't just D.C. It was Cleveland, it was Chicago, it was Atlanta, it was New York, it was L.A., it was Oakland, it was Memphis. And so these folks, this first generation of elected officials comes into power with these numbers in mind, with these statistics in mind, and also with the stories, because one of the things I did is I went back through and I looked at the archives of retired city council members who've donated their papers to various libraries around D.C. And when you look at these archives, you see letters from citizens. And these are folks that are writing saying, I can't leave my home, I'm scared. I feel like a prisoner. I feel like a stranger in my own community. I don't know what's happened to us as a community. I can't walk my kids to school because there's drug dealers on the corner. Now, who's receiving these letters, right? Because that's the second big argument in my book. The folks that are receiving these letters and that are looking at these numbers, this is the first generation of black elected officials to have any power. And these folks know the history of underprotection. They know the history of under-enforcement. Many of them were from the Civil Rights Movement. Many of them were from the South.
Yeah.
All of them remember those years where you didn't call the police in the black community if there was an assault or a robbery. The police weren't going to come, and if they were going to just make matters worse, right? And so they are bound and determined to do it differently. They feel like their obligation, they're like the judge in the story that I told you, their obligation is to protect this community that has elected them and that's never gotten enough protection. Now, the third thing, and I'll stop here to give you time to jump in, but the third thing that we got to consider is, why did they choose police, prosecutions, and prisons as the way of delivering that protection?
Yes.
And my answer there is a story about constraints. So, right, on the one hand, this is a story about these African-American elected officials, what they chose to do, the decisions they made, their thought process, right? I'm trying to elevate and excavate a black intellectual, social, cultural, political history. But at the same time, if you're going to write about African-American elected officials, you have to talk about the constraints that they're under. So one constraint is historical, right? They inherited these segregated ghetto communities that had been stripped of jobs, that had been stripped of good schools, that were locked into patterns of economic and educational isolation. Their job was to protect communities that everybody else, that we as a nation had given up on, right? We just consigned people, this ghetto underclass. We've washed our hands of them. And that was those were a significant part of their constituents. The second thing is they don't have as much power as they would like. These are local officials by and large. Even when I'm writing about federal officials, they're in the minority, right? These are local folks. They control cities, but they don't control Congress. So one of the things that I see time and time again is the frustration that the people that I'm writing about feel about how limited their options are. So many of them say, we want better schools. We want more money for jobs. We want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want mental health services. We want job training. We want parks that are not full of syringes. But we can't get all of those things because we don't have the money to make all of that happen. What we can do is what the rest of society wants to do for us or to us. What we can do is offer more police, more prosecutors, and more prisons. And so that's the route that they take.
Okay, so they're responding to crime and drug upsurges beginning in the 60s. They are mindful of a history of the underprotection of black communities, which they're determined to counter. And they only have a few options at their disposal to deal with what are large problems, national problems that require resources beyond their capacity. So we end up in this situation. I'm really struck by this kind of ambiguity of the civil rights narrative, the fact that the narrative can at one and the same time motivate a brilliant young lawyer like yourself, a former Supreme Court clerk and whatnot, to take her talent and devote it to a public defender's office in a city like Washington, D.C. That's a very significant commitment of one's resources on behalf of ideals that one is embracing, ideals about justice and fairness. But that the same narrative, the same history of commitment to civil rights can be invoked on behalf of Judge Curtis's, if that was his name, I'm sorry, speech, that he's going to send this kid to this hellhole and maybe ruin this kid's life. Granted, the kid is responsible for his own actions, but still, he can feel motivated and justified in doing so on behalf of the same civil rights narrative. So, I mean, it strikes me that there's something of a dilemma here. I'm not sure how you are thinking about it. You want security for your community, and maybe even, correct me, you want respectability for your community. On the other hand, you're the instrument of state power that's coming down in a very harsh way on people who have relatively limited opportunities in their lives and so forth. I'm wondering how you think about it and how you discovered that the principles in your research here were parsing this almost impossible dilemma.
Yeah, so that's really, really, really well put in terms of the kind of a summary of where things stand. And I guess I think twofold. So on the one hand, you and I can think about this and we can identify in a way it's not that surprising, right? If we have if there are, on matters of crime and punishment, there are two historical narratives that have always been true, right? And Randy Kennedy's book in the 90s was really powerful on this. It has always been true. He's got 100 pages devoted to the history of under-enforcement and under-protection of law, right? Black lives matter. We say that now because they never did matter, right? And also, we have running alongside that an equal history of over-punishment, over-punitiveness, right? Locking people up for trivial matters and then using that to put them into basically back in slavery-like conditions, right back in the first half of the 20th century. So those two things are part of our our inheritance as African Americans, right? The 14th Amendment is supposed to provide equal protection of the laws. We normally talk about that in terms of the rights of criminal defendants. But of course, equal protection also means you're supposed to be protected.
Yeah.
And that means victims are supposed to be protected. And that's our inheritance. And so in a way, it's not that surprising to me that you would see people who would either identify with kind of one side of that or the other. I think some people try to identify with both. I think I, like, intellectually and morally, try to very much remain committed to both of those, and not have them be in tension with one another. But okay, that's all fine for us to say right here. Now, let's talk about how the criminal justice system works. Because the way the system works is it puts you in a role. You pretty much have to make a choice. You have a function. And once you assume that function, this is just, right, psychology, human nature, this is how life works. You assume that function, you assume that role, you start to do those things. And over time, you absorb a way of thinking and you absorb patterns of behavior and forms of logic that justify and reinforce the correctness of what you're doing. And we all have that, right? For public defenders, it's the story that we tell ourselves about that incredibly guilty person who we represent, and we fight incredibly hard to get off, which I did and do, and I have a narrative about why that makes sense, and I believe that narrative. The judge and the prosecutor, they have their narratives, and so I don't think, like you said, the judge consigned him to this hellhole, but I think one of the problems of the criminal justice system is I'm describing it that way, but I don't even think the judge allowed him to think about it. He didn't allow himself. His role didn't allow him, or didn't encourage him anyway, to think about it in that way that I just described it. When he did, he would say, well, that's unfortunate. I wish it weren't like that. Somebody should fix that. The corrections department should make it better.
Yeah, but what can I do?
But what can I do?
What can he do? I mean, what would a different and somehow better history have looked like? How can the black responsible officials, whether they be on the bench or in the city council or in the state legislature, ignore the imperative if their own people are being preyed upon by their own people of doing something about it, even if what they have to do complements what some white conservative somewhere is saying needs to be done. I mean, this is a serious question. I'm not at all clear that it would have been better for the city council in the District of Columbia or the U.S. attorney, Eric Holder, at the time that you're writing about in the District of Columbia, would have been better for them not to have tried to get guns off the street or dangerous people off the street by using the punitive apparatus of law enforcement on behalf of that objective. Would a criminal justice policy run by enlightened and caring black people, could it? A criminal justice policy, not a social policy, not investment in the cities and a Marshall Plan, a criminal justice, could it possibly be any different than the policy that was actually embraced by these people and that helped to lead to the situation that we're in right now?
I think, well, if you're going to take off the table the social policies, which you did in your question, then I think it could only have been somewhat different. I think those, but so let's stay within the domain of your question, right? So, but I do think it could have been somewhat different. Certainly, I want to say, not just at the margins, and the margins start to add up in this area, right? Because there's so many different areas, there's so many different decision makers who have authority that if everybody makes decisions at the margins in a more restorative, less punitive way, it actually matters. But sure, they could have made lots of different choices. I mean, one of my first cases, I told you about Brandon's, one of the first cases, and this is not in the book, but one of the first cases that I had as a juvenile public defender was an ADW, assault with a deadly weapon, was the charge sheet posted on the wall. And I went to look at it, and normally in parentheses, it would say the weapon, which would be typically a knife or a gun or
Yeah.
a pipe or a bat.
Yeah.
And in this case, the weapon was chocolate milk. And this kid was in lockup now. I want you to understand this. He was behind bars, behind the judge's chambers in a jail cell that looks like every jail cell that you've ever seen on TV represented.
Now, this is a very serious, violent felony that this person is being charged with, assault with a deadly weapon.
Yeah, I mean, assault with a deadly weapon is after murder and rape, and it's the next one in line. And
Chocolate milk?
Chocolate milk. So I went to talk to the prosecutor because I thought it was I was new. I thought it was maybe a prank that my colleagues were pulling on me, which would have been unusual to play with something like this. There were pranksters, and I went to talk to the prosecutor, and she was experienced. And, experienced prosecutors, new public defenders, she had a very patronizing tone with me. And she said, Attorney Forman, I think you misunderstand. You must think that it was like the carton was open and that he just threw milk on the other kid, but the carton was closed. He threw a closed carton of milk. And I started laughing, which is never a good move when you're talking to a prosecutor, because I was like, oh, no, I got that the carton, because my client had already told me that he had done that. And I was like, I got the carton is closed, but how could it possibly be that you and I, two lawyers, have a kid in a cell? So think of all the things that had to happen. There was a fight. The school personnel then had to respond by calling the police. Yeah. You said, could things have done differently? They could have not called the police. Right. And I advise school personnel all the time now on how to handle these scenarios. And the police could have arrived, and the officer could have said, no, y'all got to deal with this. I've got actually
real criminals.
Right? Then the officer has to take the kid downtown, and they got to be processed. A supervisor then could have said, listen, I know you're a new officer here, but take this back. The prosecutor downtown could have. So there were basically 4 professionals, each of whom could have done something different. And my point is that our system is built on cases and decisions like that over and over and over again. So yes, I do think that there were and are ways that this could have been different.
Good. Okay. You're undoubtedly familiar with this book by Michael Fortner, Silent Black Majority, which chronicles the role that African-American community leaders and activists played in the rise of the Rockefeller drug laws in New York State. Very punitive anti-drug regime, which many black politicians and civic leaders endorsed. And in fact, Governor Nelson Rockefeller relied upon the political heft of these people to get these laws enacted. How does that story in that particular venue where, ministers leading church congregations of middle-class African Americans were at the forefront of demanding that something be done about the heroin trafficking and the violence that accompanied it, how does that relate to your narrative? Can you talk about that for a bit?
Absolutely. It very much relates. And I think that I have some disagreements with his argument, but I should start by saying I think it's a very impressive book, tremendous amount of historical research, including, archival research out of New York State. So I cite and rely on the book, especially for my first chapter talks about heroin and crime in the 60s and early 70s. So I'm writing then about the same period that he does. And I rely on his book at that moment, in part to make the point for my purposes that DC wasn't alone in this respect, right? And so I say New York, Michael Fortner. So I think the story that he tells that you've just described, I think is accurate, is consistent with my research. Where I come out a little bit differently from him is really in 2 places. One is he sets up his argument as a rebuttal to the claim that racism was front and central in creating the punitive criminal justice system that we have in America. He says explicitly that my story is a more important explanation for what happened than that story, the racism story. I disagree with that, and we can talk a little bit about that, and you might want to. The second area where he and I disagree is that the people that he writes about, and this isn't so much a disagreement about how we read the evidence as it is we just are finding different evidence. He says that this black silent majority rejected what we can loosely call root cause solutions for crime, explanations for why crime occurred and solutions for it, right? So he says they didn't want the Marshall Plan. They view soft liberal, like liberals who didn't get it, and things like that. But his black silent majority, over and over again, he says they rejected those as explanations for why blacks were committing crime or as solutions. The people that I find in DC, it's very different. There's, as I just mentioned, almost everybody that I study at some point talks about the other things that we need to do to solve this problem. You mentioned Eric Holder, right? So Eric Holder endorses pretext policing in the 1990s, which I think caused great damage. But he also says we can't arrest our way out of the solution. Yeah. We need more jobs. We need better housing. We need better schools. And almost everybody that I found says that. And so those are probably the two areas of kind of interpretation and argument where he and I are most separate.
Okay, let me just explain to people that what you mean by pretext policing is encouraging cops to look for any reason they can find to stop a vehicle, windows too heavily tainted, left turn signal didn't come on when you change lanes or whatever, just so that they can maybe get a look inside the trunk or the back seat to find out if there's a weapon there. And this is an initiative in the case that you're studying in Washington, D.C., that former Attorney General and then U.S. Attorney for the district, Eric Holder, endorsed as a response to criminal problems in the city. You say Fortner kind of poo-poos the idea that the black silent majority of his writing endorsed the root causes argument, thinking that they didn't find that an adequate explanation, and you take issue with that. But I have to ask you, and you also say about the racism question, I have to ask you, what's the evidence that addressing root causes, and I don't want to be misunderstood, I'm not against progressive social policy that increases people's life opportunities, better housing for people, income supports, medical care, something for teens to do in the summertime, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not against these policies. But offering them up as a remedy for the problems of drug trafficking on the streets or inter-gang violent conflicts such as we're seeing play itself out in a city like Chicago right now, seems like could be more, hope than actual logic. I mean, it could be that we wish, we had more progressive social policy, and we certainly need to have something to say as we lock these kids up about why the country is failing us. But what's the evidence that addressing root causes could be expected to really have a difference in the level of, insecurity in low-income communities in the cities?
Well, two things. So one, I just want to go back to clarify my disagreement with Fortner.
Sure.
Our disagreement is not about whether those things would work or not work, right? Our disagreement is a historical interpretation. That is to say, I say that the African American activists and intellectuals and politicians who I'm studying embraced and endorsed root cause solutions.
Okay.
They just couldn't get them. He says they rejected those solutions as hopeless as the work of kind of liberal suburban sociologists. So neither he nor I is actually we're not arguing about whether they in fact worked. Okay. As much as whether the people we're writing about thought they would work.
And you are looking you're looking mainly at the district, and he's looking mainly at New York City. So it could well be that both things are true in the places where you were looking.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Now,
I'm happy to talk about I'm happy to talk about your question as well too, if you want to. I wasn't.
Well, yeah, okay. So that's been clarified. Let's talk about my question. Why do you believe, as I think you do believe, that a more expansive social policy would really help to remedy this problem and maybe be more effective than law enforcement and incarceration.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it for, for all kinds of reasons. I mean, we could just start with the fact that when you look at the places where crime and violence are highest, all of those places are places where the jobs are the fewest, where poverty is the greatest, and where the education is most lacking. And so when you have a middle class community with adequate social supports and jobs that are available to people, you have lower crime rates. At least you have lower street crime rates. You may have other kinds of crime. But in terms of street crime, it's much lower. I also believe it from my own experience. I mean, when I was representing kids in Washington, D.C., in juvenile court, almost to a person, my clients said, when I would ask them, like, what would you want from government? Like, what do you need? And almost to a person, my clients in juvenile court said, I want a job. I mean, it was shocking how many of them all identified that as a thing, which is why I'm somebody who, like, I'm like all in on progressive social policy. But if you force me to pick one thing that I thought we needed to do in cities, it would be jobs.
Yeah.
And so I started a program where we hired kids, and we started a nonprofit. We opened a pizza shop, and we hired kids who had been in juvenile court. And we told them, you have a job. And the deal was that they had to come for tutoring, and then they got to work at this pizza shop. I mean, it was minimum wage. It was nothing special. But it was a job. It put money in their pocket. And we saw then, and we've seen in the 20 years since that we've been doing it, dramatically lower. Recidivism is not the main thing we measure, because we want to measure sort of, things like high school graduation and college going, but we also see that kids drop out of the illegal economy very quickly, and they move into because now they've given, it's common sense in a way,
yeah.
But they now have something to look forward to in their day, and they have something to look forward to at the end of the week, and they have a reason to keep working and stay out of trouble. So I view it, on multiple levels, from the kind of research I've looked at, as well as my own experience as a practitioner.
Just curious, is this New Haven where you've developed this?
DC. This is in DC.
In the district, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so I feel that as a card-carrying social scientist, I have to push back a little bit and make the following observations. Correlation is not causation. You say everywhere you look where there's high crime in the cities, you find no jobs, and you find low incomes and other social maladies, and therefore perhaps addressing those maladies would reduce crime rates. And the observation that I feel obliged to make is that, hey, if people are free to move around, the ones who are employed and who are resourceful and who are law-abiding and whatnot are likely to vacate areas of the city that are relatively unsafe. So if I end up in a situation where I see a correlation between social disadvantage and high crime rates, it doesn't follow from that. I haven't demonstrated by that an intervention that improved housing or that gave kids summer jobs would be a causal agent to lead to a reduction in criminal offending, people might say. They might also say that if I look over time, say, for example, in the last few years, I've seen an uptick, I mean, modest relative to the long swing of historical movements, but I see an uptick in violent criminal offending in some American cities. I haven't really seen much change over the last 2, 3, 4 years in the degree of poverty or the inadequacy of educational institutions or, the unemployment rate among teenagers. But I have seen a change in behavior. So how can I just assume that social conditions are the major driving factor in criminal offending? What happened to families? What happened to values? Et cetera, et cetera. Such a person might say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really, I guess, I guess you're entitled to have that view.
Okay, I can see you're not convinced by that.
No, I'm not, but I also think that I also think that the things that I'm talking about, in my view, are the moral things to do for our communities, whether
Regardless,
or not they reduce crime.
I agree
I
with that.
also believe that they will reduce crime,
Okay.
but that's not even my main reason for making an argument.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me ask you, James, about the other aspect of where you take a little bit of issue with Michael Fortner, and that is about he positions himself explicitly as countering a narrative that I could associate with Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, and others, that mass incarceration and the over inclusion of African Americans in that is a reflection of racism. You take issue with that. That is to say, you think it is indeed a reflection, at least to some degree, of racism. Can you talk a little bit about why you are, and correct me if I get this wrong, in a way taking Michelle Alexander's side in the dispute between her and Michael Fortner about what the root causes now of mass incarceration are in this country?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I should say that although I am taking her side, you're right, but I'm not just taking her side,
Okay.
because, we could point to, I mean, if we're going to sort of flesh out that side of the argument, we got to talk about people like Brian
I'm sorry, say that again. You broke up a
Stevenson
little
and his
bit.
book Jealousy.
Uh,
So I'm sorry, we have to talk. Can you hear me?
I hear you now, yeah.
We have to talk about people like Brian Stevenson and his
Okay.
book Just Mercy. We have to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates and his book. We have to talk about your work. There's a lot of I mean, the new Jim Crow has gotten a lot of and deserved attention.
Yeah.
But the notion that racism and white supremacy, historical, ongoing, have helped to form and shape American society and have helped to create the criminal justice system that we have and have helped to sustain it are one of the reasons why we aren't appalled when we see some of the racial disparities, right? I mean, your work on stigma, I mean, I remember reading 10 or 15 years ago, you asking the question, how come it is not a national emergency when we see some of the statistics that you and I can cite about black children, young black men, young black women in the criminal justice system? Yeah. And you said, well, if we had those disparities among other groups, we would right now, as a nation, stop everything else we were doing and saying, we got to attend to that. We got to try everything. You were asking me before about, does it work or does it not work to try this intervention or that intervention? Right. Your point, as I read you a decade ago, was we would try every single one of those interventions and we'd figure it out. Like, we haven't tried yet, but we would sure as hell be devoting everything in our arsenal to answering those questions. And right now, you and I can continue to kind of like have a social scientist debate because we actually haven't tried the kind of, and I'm not talking about a single program. I'm not talking about bringing in a summer camp and then measuring that. I'm talking about bringing in everything. I'm talking about bringing in the jobs and the schools and the summer camp and the drug treatment program and the mental health programs, and doing it all at once in a sustained fashion, not dependent on funding cuts for a long period of time, and then assessing. And your point was we would do that if these were not black children who we had not already stigmatized. So there's, to me, a lot of people who have made a version of the point that Michelle makes so eloquently in the new Jim Crow. Why do I take that side? Partially, it's because I think we have so much historical evidence of both racial animus, racial stigma, and racial indifference, and the role that they have played in creating punitive laws. But also, just step back for a minute. Forget about all that. If I were to tell you that we had one group in this country that was 13% of the population, that was historically subordinated, that was facing a 100 wealth gap, that had a few senators in history, and until recently, only one president who was of that complexion, and I were to say, okay, is the history of that group and their actions and their attitudes going to be a more powerful explanatory variable for a particular social phenomenon? Or are we going to try to look at what the majority has done? You would say, well, of course, let's look at the majority. They have more power. And so as between my story, which I think is compelling and important and fascinating, and I want people to study it, but if you're trying to figure out what happened in the country, if you want to know what Reagan did, if you want to know what Pete Wilson did in California, if you want to know what America did, it's inconceivable to me that you would say black local elected officials and activists are going to be the answer. It's just illogical.
That's very compelling and very well said, James. You're putting me in mind of Khalil Muhammad's masterful book, The Condemnation of Blackness, which goes all the way back to before the progressive era and tracing, to the late 19th century, in tracing the evolution of thinking in the academy and politics, the urban social policy and so forth, and the role that race played in founding some of these institutions that we're still living with today. So, point well taken. Listen, I don't know if you've got anything else to say. I think I've taken enough of your time, and I think we kind of, got the book on the screen here at the Glenn Show. So I'll give you the last word if you have any.
No, I appreciate you having me on. This was a real pleasure.
I appreciate the kind words you said about my work. You got it just right. Indeed, those are our kids, and if we thought of them genuinely as our kids, if the philanthropists and the politically ambitious politicians and the people running cities and the Congress and whatnot thought of that as our kids suffering, if they put as much weight on the well-being of those people as they would on their own people, we would have tried whatever we could have thought to try, and we wouldn't have stopped trying until we found something that worked to ease the burden on these people. No Americans should have to suffer the depredations and the delimitation of life chances that is associated with the over-incarceration of African Americans. That's my view, and I'm sticking by it. I'm inspired by your work in that regard. So thank you very much, James.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, take care then.
Bye-bye.